First, a rumble, as if the earth itself were collapsing. Then, a whistle in the air, and a moment later, a stone boulder, weighing as much as an entire forge, slams into the wall. Stones fly at the speed of a tornado, leaving traces of dust and death in the air. Historians wrote that these stone projectiles weighed up to 25 kilograms and flew over 300 meters. This is not a metaphor. These are facts, recorded by Roman military engineers. And this monster was controlled not by a human, but by a machine, which the Romans themselves nicknamed Wild Ass, the onager. But why an ass precisely? Why not a bull, not a lion, not a stronger beast? In this name lies the very essence of its character. The onager is an ancient Roman throwing machine, a type of catapult which used the torque of twisted bundles. Its power was born from compressed fury, as if the earth itself were repelling the projectile. The Romans said that its strike was like the kick of a wild ass, sharp, unpredictable, devastating. And this comparison proved more accurate than any formula. Imagine a Roman camp, straight lines of tents, the clang of hammers, the smell of tar. Near the fortress wall itself, a wooden tower. Next to it, several people turn heavy winches. The creaking intensifies, ropes are pulled taut, the wood groans. And then, an explosion of silence. A mighty jerk. The wooden frame is sharply thrown back, and a stone rushes through the air, leaving behind dust and an echo. Every shot of the onager, like the strike of fate's hammer. Archaeological findings confirm the existence of such machines in Roman camps in territories from Britain to Syria. Their remains were found next to stone projectiles and metal fastening elements, but the very idea of throwing 20-kilogram boulders 300 meters was not born from a desire to impress. It was a weapon of desperation and discipline. When the Romans encountered the impregnable fortresses of the East, ordinary battering rams and ladders ceased to work. Then they turned their minds towards force, mechanical force. Roman sources mention that the first version of the onager was created around the end of the 1st century BC, during a period of active sieges in Asia Minor. Polybius and Vitruvius described the principles of operation of machines that used twisted bundles of hair or sinews. These tight bundles imparted colossal tension to the lever and transformed a simple stone into a deadly projectile. Modern reconstructions show that the shot was accompanied by a sound that could be compared to an artillery volley. But every mechanical marvel had its own Roman genius, a person who saw in wood and rope not just material, but a weapon. In the headquarters of any field camp, there existed the position of an engineer who was called an Architectus Ballistarium. He was responsible for all throwing machines, their calibration, and the accuracy of their shots. Not only victory, but also the lives of entire cohorts depended on his calculations. Every such engineer knew an error of 1 degree in the angle of inclination, and the stone would not destroy the wall, but hit their own. Therefore, the Romans treated onagers as living beings. They were fed with grease, their wheels were lubricated, and ropes were checked before each shot. A broken bundle could lead to catastrophe. Planks would burst, splinters would fly, soldiers would die next to their own weapon. All this made the onager not just a machine, but a symbol of the Roman character, precise, stubborn, and capable of transforming patience into destructive force. But before this machine became a legend, Rome traveled a long path from simple siege towers to mechanical wonders, where physics became an ally of the empire. And it was on this path that the Romans understood. Strength is not only the muscles of legionaries, but also a taut bowstring made from the hair of their enemies. The sun scorched the flat plain, and Roman legionaries, step by step, pulled heavy beams and leather bundles along the dusty road. The empire advanced eastward, into lands where cities erected walls several human heights thick. And here, on these stone bastions, not only the strength of the legions, but also the genius of their engineers was tested. Historians wrote that it was during the reign of Emperor Augustus, around the end of the 1st century BC, that the Romans brought the art of siege engines to the limit of precision. Among these inventions, the onager became not just a tool, but a symbol of a new military era, where victory was decided not by the shouts of soldiers, but by the calculation of angles and trajectories. Whoever saw an onager for the first time could not help but feel fear and admiration. On the field stood a wooden frame the size of a cart, reinforced with bronze rings. In the center, a vertical post with a powerful lever, at the end of which a leather sling for the stone was attached. All this was held by bundles of twisted sinews, soaked in grease. When the lever was pulled down by winches, the machine seemed to freeze in furious tension, like a wild beast before a leap. At that moment, soldiers moved aside. They knew that the ass did not forgive mistakes. It was this tension that became the essence of the term torsion, the principle by which Roman catapults operated. Torsional energy is the force arising from the twisting of elastic bundles. The Greeks knew of it, but the Romans brought it to perfection. Each bundle consisted of hundreds of strands, most often made from horsehair or animal sinews. They were lubricated to prevent drying out and replaced after every major siege. This was living mechanics, flesh, wood, and metal in a single system. Modern reconstructors calculated that the tension of the bundles in a large onager reached several tons. Upon firing, the lever accelerated the stone to a speed of over 100 kilometers per hour. Striking the wall, such a projectile would penetrate the masonry and cause a collapse. Roman engineers noted that the firing angle should have been around 45 degrees. It was precisely this that allowed the projectile to be thrown 300 meters. These figures are not legend. The calculations match the machine fragments found by archaeologists and the descriptions of Vitruvius, the Roman military architect. But behind each shot stood a team of 6 to 8 people. 1 checked the tension, 2 operated the winches, 1 was responsible for feeding the stone, and 2 more secured the mechanism against breakdown. The commander gave the order by raising a wooden stick, and the air filled with a sound similar to a clap of thunder. After the shot, the ass sprang back, sometimes even breaking the stops. This recoil gave the machine its name. It thrashed about like a wild animal. Each legion had an entire battery of such machines, commanded by an officer called the Praefectus Ballistarum. His task was to coordinate fire, establishing a rhythm of strikes like an orchestra of war. Hundreds of stones flew in an arc, smashing towers and gates. Where assaults previously lasted weeks, now a single day was enough. Livy wrote that during the siege of Amida, a single volley of onagers destroyed a tower 10 cubits thick. Even enemies acknowledged the Romans had turned warfare into an engineering science. But this science also had a dark side. To assemble one onager, about 300 kilograms of wood and iron were required. The delivery of bundles, which were made from animal sinews, took weeks. In campaign conditions, the machines often had to be dismantled and transported on mules. Each stone weighed 20 or 25 kilograms, meaning even a single volley required the efforts of a full dozen soldiers. Legionaries didn't just fight. They built, pulled, lubricated, calculated. And in this combination of labor and death, the image of Rome was born. An empire that knew no bounds, as long as it could measure them by the number of steps and the tension of a rope. But the power of the onager lay not only in physics, it carried fear with it. The enemies of the Romans recounted that with the first shot, the walls seemed to tremble from the cry of an invisible beast. Stones falling from the sky caused panic. No one understood where they were coming from. The psychological effect was colossal. Even if the machine didn't hit its target, its mere presence broke the will of the defenders. Chronicles state that in some sieges, enemies surrendered just by seeing the legionaries setting up their machines. And yet, despite its power, the onager remained an unreliable ally. It was capricious, dependent on humidity, wind, and the condition of its bundles. Sometimes, during a shot, the lever would break, turning the weapon into a deadly trap for its own men. But it was precisely this danger that made the onager a symbol of the Roman Empire itself: strong, calculating, and yet fatally vulnerable when its own power spun out of control. Thus, the Romans understood. To control power means to tame a wild beast. And each time they positioned their machine anew, they seemed to ask the sky, would it withstand another blow? When the first rays of the sun touched the Roman camp, dozens of wooden machines already stood in position. The air smelled of tar, then of iron. The centurion slowly walked the line, checking ropes, ordering cracked beams to be replaced, scolding those who had poorly greased the bundles. The siege morning began like a sacred ritual. Every mistake could cost lives. Below, beneath the walls, the defenders made noise, hurling insults and arrows, but in Rome's camp, silence reigned. Only the faint creak of winches and the steady breathing of legionaries tightening ropes disturbed it, and when the first stone was raised into the sling, it seemed as if the earth itself held its breath. Historians wrote that the Romans began the bombardment at dawn when the sun shone into the enemy's eyes. The light blinded the defenders, and stones flying from the glare seemed like messengers from the gods. The tactic was flawless. Several onagers fired in turn to create a continuous rhythm of impacts. Each stone fell from the sky a few seconds after the previous one. This rain of stone broke walls, towers, and human will. It was then that the Romans used the concept of a battery, a group of machines operating synchronously. One of the most important terms describing this process is ballista. This was the onager's older sister, throwing not stones but arrows and spears. If the onager shattered walls, the ballista struck people. Together they created a deadly duo where the sound of impact and the whistle of arrows merged into a single orchestra of destruction. Modern scholars note that in a typical siege, up to 20 machines of each type could be used. For the enemy, this was equivalent to a natural disaster. Stones rained down from above, and iron bolts pierced everything that moved below. Livy wrote that during the siege of Philippopolis in Asia Minor, the stone projectiles of onagers knocked down the merlons of fortress walls, turning them into dust. Each shot was expensive. Stones had to be quarried, polished, and fitted to size, but the effect justified everything. In a day, a battery could fire hundreds of projectiles. Archaeologists found piles of spherical stones of uniform diameter next to former camps. These were the ammunition of antiquity. They were prepared in advance and stored near the machines, like modern artillery shells. The Romans knew the value of speed. To maintain the pace, they organized special detachments of slaves and auxiliary soldiers. These people carried projectiles, replaced broken parts, and tightened the bundles. The work was hellish: heat, dust, roar. Legionaries often suffered burns from incandescent metal fittings, and their hands were cut by the sinew fibers. But discipline did not allow them to stop. The centurion's order was brief: tendere, to tension, and immediately dozens of hands grasped the winches. Modern calculations show that the average firing rate of an onager was 1 shot every 2 minutes. This was enough to destroy a wall in a day. But the Romans did not rush. They methodically changed the firing angle, studying the enemy's reaction. The machines struck not only fortifications, but also inner courtyards, causing fires. Stones soaked in tar ignited upon impact. Thus they turned the siege into a firestorm. In Roman camps, a strict safety protocol existed. No one was allowed to stand behind an onager. Upon firing, the lever recoiled with monstrous force. Chronicles describe instances where a soldier's head was severed by a single strike of the beam. Therefore, the Romans placed wooden shields and fences nearby to contain the recoil. This deadly danger fostered special respect. Legionaries said that the onager demanded obedience and courage, like a capricious god. According to Tacitus, engineers observed the trajectory of the stones for long periods, noting where they fell. After each volley, they moved the machine by several cubits to refine the angle. Everything happened with astonishing precision. Even wind and humidity were taken into account. Warriors checked the tension of the bundles before each shot. This obsession with precision distinguished the Romans from all their enemies. Their strength lay not in surprise, but in inevitability. And yet, when the rumble of stones subsided, the siege field transformed into a landscape of fear. Walls gaped with holes, bodies lay below, and the Romans were already lifting new stones. They knew that every fortress would fall. It was only a matter of time. This realization made them almost merciless. In the evening, by the campfires, legionaries would say, "The wild ass does not sleep until it breaks the stone." And in these words was not just a joke, but the philosophy of an empire. It was then that a new understanding of war originated in Rome, not as a burst of fury, but as the art of calculation. The onager became a symbol of this era, where human will merged with the cold logic of mechanics. But the stronger the weapon became, the closer another force crept up on the Romans, their own pride, ready one day to strike as suddenly as a wild ass at dawn. Dust stood in a column, the sun hit their eyes, and the air trembled with heat and hum. Where a majestic city once stood, now only walls with breaches and smoke rose. This was the moment when the onager revealed all its monstrous power. Stones flying from the heavens destroyed everything. Columns, gates, temples. The siege turned into slow destruction. Historians wrote that during Trajan's campaigns in the east, such machines were used universally. Every fortress, every tower knew this sound. The hoarse thud of the lever, the whistle of air, and the dull roar of a falling stone. The Romans did not shoot at random. Every strike had a target, calculated down to the cubit. On the walls remained indentations of uniform size, as if a single invisible hand had worked upon them. An officer called the centurion of artillery was responsible for accuracy. He was trained in geometry, angle measurement, and range calculation. He had special instruments, wooden protractors and rulers with notches, allowing him to construct the trajectory. These tools, simple in appearance, transformed war into a science. The culmination of any siege arrived when the walls began to crack. Stones weighing 25 kilograms fell from a height of tens of meters and pierced the masonry like a knife through butter. The hum was so great that voices drowned in it. The ground trembled underfoot, and inside the fortress everything turned into chaos. Defenders scurried, trying to patch holes, but each patch immediately shattered under a new blow. Livy wrote that during a siege in Armenia, a tower made of white limestone collapsed after the 30th volley. The word siege itself in Latin sounded like obsidio, encirclement, pressure. And it was pressure, not surprise, that was Rome's main weapon. Legionaries did not strive for quick victories. They pressed, methodically and inexorably, until the enemy broke from within. The onager became the embodiment of this principle, a machine that knows no weariness. It could be repaired, ropes changed, levers reinforced, but the very rhythm of its strikes remained the same, measured, cold, like the pulse of the empire. Archaeological findings confirm the accounts of ancient authors. In the area of Numantia, an ancient fortress in Spain, dozens of round stones with chipped edges were found, traces of impact against walls. Some projectiles still retain remnants of the tar with which they were coated for greater durability. Scholars suggest that these projectiles belonged to Roman onagers from the time of the Scipios. Thus, beneath a layer of dust, archaeologists found not just a weapon, but traces of thought, embodied in stone. The tactical skill of the Romans was evident in their ability to combine different types of weapons. Onagers struck walls, ballistas targeted towers, and scorpions aimed at living forces. The scorpion, a smaller version of the ballista, launched iron bolts a meter long. These machines stood closer to the front line, protecting the legionaries who carried stones. The entire siege resembled a theatrical production, where each mechanism had its place and each soldier knew their role. While stones tore at the walls, under the cover of smoke and dust, sappers approached the walls. They dug tunnels, set fire to beams, and positioned battering rams, and all this happened amidst the roar of the onagers. These machines not only destroyed, they distracted attention, created noise, and prevented the enemy from hearing the steps of approaching legionaries. It was a symphonic terror, where every detail worked for the overall effect. But power had a price. With each shot, the machine experienced enormous stress. After several dozen volleys, beams cracked, bundles stretched, and engineers were forced to dismantle the structure, replacing parts. This took hours, sometimes days. Nevertheless, the Romans always had a reserve, a supply of ropes, iron clamps, tar. Their logistics were astonishing. For one major siege, they required up to 300 tons of materials. All of this was delivered by caravans from the rear. The legionaries themselves lived alongside these machines for weeks. They grew accustomed to their sound, as others grow accustomed to rain. Stones fell on the walls with a specific rhythm, and over time this rhythm became the music of war. Soldiers knew, as long as the ass roars, the empire lives. This sound became part of their faith, in order, in strength, in the eternity of Rome. Tacitus mentioned that some legions even decorated their onagers, painting symbols on them, applying Latin mottos: non cedit, it does not yield; ultima manus, the final blow. These inscriptions were not bravado. They were a way to remind themselves that the machine was an extension of man, and as long as man is precise and indefatigable, his weapon will also live. When the walls of the besieged city finally collapsed, the Romans did not rush in. They waited until the dust settled, until the enemy had completely lost spirit. Only then, to the sound of trumpets and drums, did they advance. The rumble of stones subsided, and the silence seemed even more terrifying. For everyone knew, tomorrow this sound would be repeated, at a new wall, under a different sun. Rome moved on, and the wild ass prepared to leap again. When the dust settled and the walls finally collapsed, the final act of the Roman siege began. The entrance to the city was open, but the silence did not mean the end. The onager stopped, like a beast that had fulfilled its command. Its lever slowly lowered, and the soldiers approached the machine as if it were a living creature, carefully, with respect. They knew. Just yesterday, this wooden beast had decided the fate of thousands of people. Historians note that after the siege concluded, engineers meticulously inspected every detail of the machine, like priests examining the remains of a sacrifice. If the onager survived and did not crack, it was considered blessed. At this moment, Rome celebrated not only victory, but also the triumph of engineering intellect. The empire rested not on chance, but on calculation. Even destruction was mathematical for them. When the debris of the walls fell into the city, the Romans already knew where they would set up camp, how they would lay water pipes, where they would build the forum. The stones that had recently been weapons now became building material for a new province. Thus, war transformed into a continuation of architecture. One of the most vivid descriptions of the consequences of using onagers was mentioned by Ammianus Marcellinus, who wrote about the destruction of Amida in the 4th century A.D. He noted that stones fell from the heavens as if Juno herself were hurling them from Olympus. This was not just an image, but the reality of an ancient battlefield, burning houses, corpses under the ruins, silence after the storm. The warriors standing next to the machines did not rejoice. They looked at the ruins and understood that this was the result of their labor, precise like a carpenter's work, yet merciless. Here it is worth introducing the concept of Legio Fabrum, the Engineer Legion. These were not just soldiers, but specialists, builders, and craftsmen. They designed machines, calculated the strength of beams, and monitored the tension of ropes. In their hands, war transformed into a craft. Without them, no onager would have been raised, no volley fired. The Romans said, "Victory is won not by the sword, but by the mind that draws the bowstring." After a siege, the machines were dismantled. Parts made of valuable wood, ash, oak, beech, were salvaged for reuse. Leather bundles were replaced with new ones, and metal elements were reforged. It was a closed cycle. War fed itself. In large garrisons, there were workshops where dozens of disassembled onagers constantly stood, ready for a new campaign. Archaeologists found tools, blueprints, broken levers there, and all this confirmed Rome created a system of continuous weapon production centuries before the industrial age. But behind all these calculations were people. Soldiers who for months pulled heavy beams, slept on the ground, ate rations of bread, wine, and salted meat. Each of them wore armor weighing 20 kilograms, and yet had to operate a machine whose lever alone weighed 3 times as much. They were simultaneously builders and destroyers. In their eyes, there was no hatred, only habit. Rome taught them to see destruction as part of order. In some campaigns, according to Cassius Dio, enemies tried to use their own analogs of onagers against the Romans, but more often this ended in disaster. Poorly calculated machines broke down, and projectiles fell directly into their own ranks. The Romans, however, could afford something no one else had: stability. Their machines were built to standards. The size of the lever, the length of the bundle, the mass of the stone, everything was identical, so that any engineer could assemble an onager from memory, just as a legionary knows his formation. The psychological impact of this weapon was no less than the physical. Even after capturing a city, the Romans left several machines in plain sight to keep the conquered in fear. The onager became more than just a means of war. It transformed into a symbol of power. It was depicted on bas-reliefs, minted on coins, and sometimes installed in forums in memory of great victories. For the Romans, it was a monument to their own intellect. But every symbol has a flip side. Gradually, the dependence on machines began to change the army itself. Where once the valor of the warrior decided, now mechanics won. Commanders increasingly relied on engineers, not on bravery. Caesar still saw war as the art of maneuver, but his successors as a game of numbers and angles. With each new ass, Rome became colder, more rational, more precise. And yet, in this precision lay its vulnerability as well. The empire, accustomed to controlling every lever, would one day face an enemy against whom calculations would not help, where not physics but spirit decides. And then the ass, once a symbol of strength, would turn into a reminder. Any machine can only be strained to its limit. Then it breaks. Over the years, the onager grew larger, heavier, more perfect. But the more perfect the weapon became, the further the meaning of its use drifted from man. Rome transformed war into a ritual, predictable, refined, cold. Stones flew along a parabola, described by the hand of a geometer, and fell upon the heads of those who did not know algebra. Thus the empire proved its superiority, not only by force, but also by number, formula, precision. And yet, in this perfection, the end already lurked. When the empire began to crack from within, the onagers still stood on the walls. But now they defended Rome, not conquered foreign cities. The old mechanisms, once the pride of the legions, rotted on the towers, their bowstrings sagged, and no one knew how to properly tension them anew. The tradition of oblivion caught up with even the engineers. Formulas were lost. Treatises crumbled into dust. In the 5th century AD, chroniclers wrote that during the siege of Rome itself, the remaining machines fired unevenly, like old men who had lost their memory. When the barbarians broke into the city, they saw these behemoths and did not understand how to use them. Iron clamps had rusted, bundles had rotted, levers had broken. What was once the embodiment of order had turned into a pile of wood and bones. There was something symbolic in this. The ass, which for centuries had torn down walls, itself became bound by time. The machine, which served power, could not exist without it. And yet, in the ruins of ancient workshops, amidst debris and sand, traces remained. Nails, pieces of bronze, polished from constant impacts. Later, in the Middle Ages, people reinvented throwing machines, not knowing they were repeating the Roman idea. They would give them new names, trebuchet, mangonel, but the principle would remain the same. The shadow of the onager would continue to live in every new invention. Thus, the wild ass, a symbol of destruction, transformed into a symbol of memory. Rome fell, but its technology outlived its creators. The onager became a metaphor for a civilization that believed it could control any force, until it understood that force requires not only calculation, but also measure. And perhaps, at that moment, when the last machine split in half, beneath its debris, the idea of the empire's infallibility was buried forever.